Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Farther Afield by Miss Reed. It's the beginning of summer term, and Miss Reed and Mrs. Pringle are setting out to do a little house cleaning. A little later, over coffee, Mrs. Pringle gave me up-to-date news of the village. "You've heard about the flower show, I suppose?" she began. I confessed that I had not attended this Fairacre event on the previous Saturday. "A good thing. There's trouble brewing. Mr. Willett says he's writing to the paper about it." "Why? What happened?" "You may well ask. Mr. Robert won first prize for the best-kept garden." This did not seem surprising to me. Our local farmer always keeps a fine display of flowers and vegetables. "What about it?" Mrs. Pringle took a deep breath so that her corsets creaked. "Mr. Roberts," she said with dreadful emphasis, "has Tom Banks workin' in that garden 3 days a week, if workin' you can call it, and what's more, he had all the farmyard manure at his beck and call. How can us cottagers compete with that?" I saw her point. "The flower show's never been the same," said Mrs. Pringle, "since that fellow that worked up the atomic got on the committee. Good thing he's been posted elsewhere, but the trouble still remains. All this Jack's as good as his master nonsense. Don't you remember the outcry when he wiped out the cottager classes? Said it was degrading to have 2 types of entry. As though we bothered. If you does your own diggin' and plantin', you're a cottager. If you gets help, you're not. I never could see why that man was allowed to question the ways of the Almighty. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, says the hymn. And what's wrong with that, I'd like to know? If there's been a cottagers' class, there's always used to be, then Mr. Willett would have come first, and rightly so. He's drafted a fair knockout letter to the Caxley." I said I should look forward to reading it in the next week's Caxley Chronicle. "Oh, I don't say it'll be ready that early," said Mrs. Pringle, stacking our cups. "So far, it's only got as far as the first draft on a page of Alice Willett's laundry book, but he's keeping at it." She replaced the lid of the biscuit tin. "Mrs. Partridge's niece goes back to London today. I should think she and the vicar will be downright thankful. As far as I can hear, the girl's done nothing but wash her hair and walk around with one of those horrible transistors all day." "She's supposed to be a very clever girl," I said, rising to the absent one's defense. "Being clever don't get you far," sniffed Mrs. Pringle. "There's some not 100 miles from here who's passed examinations and that, but don't know more than the cat what's in their cupboards." Reminded of her duties, she rose and removed the tray from the kitchen table to the draining board. "You'd least bother me," she told me, "if you made yourself scarce while I tackle the china cupboard. I don't trust myself to keep a civil tongue in my head while that's being bottomed, and I've never been one to speak out of place, I hope." She glanced at me sharply. I suppose you wouldn't have such a thing as some good white paper for lining the shelves when I've washed them?" "As a matter of fact," I said with some pride, "there's a roll of lining paper upstairs. I'll run up and get it." It was pleasant to dazzle Mrs. Pringle with my efficiency for once, and I rooted about in the landing cupboard among boxes of stationery, stored Christmas tree decorations, and a mound of yellowing cuttings from magazines, which I tried to deceive myself into calling reference material, although in my honest moments I knew full well that I should never refer to them. The roll of lining paper had managed to work its way to the very bottom of the cupboard and right to the back behind a pile of box files dusty with age, bearing such labels as infant handwork ideas, historical costumes, and the like. I wouldn't mind betting that most teachers have just such a collection of junk tucked away, carefully garnered as an insurance against the future, and looked at only once in a blue moon or else forgotten entirely. The cupboard was a deep one, and by the time I had wriggled the slippery roll from behind the boxes, I was hot and dusty and had laddered one stocking. I struggled to my feet, feeling quite giddy with my exertions. I hoisted one of the dusty files under one arm. It contained, if I remembered rightly, some patterns for making simple lampshades, and these might prove useful for handwork next term. I would go through the box at my leisure. Mrs. Pringle's lining paper began to behave like a telescope, the inside sliding out at remarkable speed. From being 18 inches in length, the roll rapidly became 30 and caught itself in the banisters as I took the first unsteady step downward. Everything happened at once. The heavy file slipped, the lining paper jammed, my ankle turned over with a crack, and the hall carpet rushed upward to meet me amidst whirling darkness lit with stars. The latter moved into a circle as though to embark on gathering peascods. Suddenly, they vanished altogether, and I wondered why so many bells were ringing. When I came round, I was sitting on the bottom stair with my face against Mrs. Pringle's bosom. It was enough to bring me rapidly to full consciousness. "You bit and fell down," said that lady reproachfully. There seemed nothing to add. 5 minutes later, on the sofa, I found myself trying to control my chattering teeth and to assess the damage done. Mrs. Pringle, who had collected the papers strewn all over the hall, now surveyed me lugubriously. "Well, you've made a proper job of it," she told me with some satisfaction. "If you don't have a black eye by morning, I'll eat my hat, and something's not right with that angle." "Sprained," I said. "Nothing more, but my arm feels strange." It hung down at approximately its usual angle, but felt queerly heavy. "Could be broken," Mrs. Pringle suggested, about to investigate. "Don't touch it," I squealed. I lifted it carefully. "I don't think it can be broken," I said. "I mean, there aren't any bones sticking through the flesh, and it isn't a funny shape, is it?" "Could still be broken," replied Mrs. Pringle with conviction. "You don't know much about it, do you?" I admitted that I was entirely ignorant when it came to anatomy, as all I knew was that I was shaking and cold, and for 2 pins I would have howled like a dog. "I should like some brandy," I said. "It's in the sideboard." Leaning back, I closed my eyes and gave myself over to being a casualty. Hell, how that ankle hurt! It would be swollen to twice the size in an hour, that was sure, and heaven alone knew what was the matter with my right arm. I took the proffered glass in my left hand and sipped the firewater. "Where's Dr. Martin this morning?" I asked. "He'd better look me over, I suppose." "Wednesday," said Mrs. Pringle, seating herself heavily on the end of the sofa, far too close to my damaged ankle for my peace of mind. "Wednesdays he's in Fairacre. He'll be at Margaret Waters sometime this morning, having a look at her bad leg. What a bit of luck." "Who for?" I said crossly. "Oh, never mind. I'll ring there and leave a message." I struggled to my feet, screamed, and fell back onto the sofa again. "It's the drink," said Mrs. Pringle in a voice of doom. I remembered that the blood of dozens of blue ribboners beat in her veins, and regretted that I had allowed her to administer brandy to me, even for purely restorative purposes. "No," I managed to say, "it's the ankle. Perhaps you would ring Miss Waters, and ask her to see if Dr. Martin could call?" She went into the hall, and I swallowed the rest of the brandy. It was such a solace in the midst of my increasing discomfort that, for the first time in my life, I began to understand why people took to the bottle. I lay back and surveyed the room through half-closed eyes. A bump over my right eye was coming up at an alarming rate. Would it be the size of a pigeon's egg by the time the doctor arrived, I wondered? And why a pigeon's egg? Why not a hen's or a bantam's egg? Objects in the room had a tendency to shift to the left when I looked at them, and the curtains swayed in a highly distracting fashion. The clock on the mantelpiece grew large and then small in a rhythmic manner, and I began to feel as though the sofa had floated out to sea and we'd run into a heavy swell. Above the rushing noise in my head, I heard Mrs. Pringle's boom from the hall. I'll tell her, Miss Waters. She'll be glad to see him. She looks very poorly to me, very poorly indeed. Oh, no doubt it'll be hospital with these injuries. Yes, I'll let you know. I'm not going to hospital, I shouted to the open door. Something crashed inside my head, and groaning, I turned my face into the sofa, giving the bump a second wallop. Mrs. Pringle appeared in the doorway. It's a good thing it's the first day of holidays, she said smugly. Give you plenty of time to get over it, won't it, dear? I drew in my breath painfully. Mrs. Pringle, I said very quietly and carefully, I could do with a little more brandy. Chapter 3. Medical Matters. Extreme pain, it seems, has a curiously numbing effect on one's normal reactions. Preoccupied as I was with my afflictions, Mrs. Pringle's deplorable remark, which ordinarily would have roused my fury, now simply appeared to be unhappy but true. It certainly looked as though a week at least would be needed to put me back into fighting trim. Nursing my arm, I began to mourn those blissfully planned picnics, the efficient tidying up, and the trips to distant places. Can't see you doing much in the next week or two, announced Mrs. Pringle, as if divining my melancholy thoughts. When my John sprained his ankle at football, it was all of 3 months before he could put his weight on it, and him a young man, of course. Still cocooned in my pain from these barbs, I nodded agreement. Tell you what, said the lady, I could come in each morning for an hour or so, seeing as it's holiday time, get you an egg, say, or some soup to keep you going. It was a kind thought, and I did my best to register gratitude. By now the arm was beginning to swell and hurt badly. Would Dr. Martin be able to get my sleeve rolled up? Would it have to be cut from the frock? Alarmed now, I sat up and begged Mrs. Pringle to help in my undressing. Before the doctor comes, she asked, scandalized. I explained my fears. If that's all, I can slit it now with the kitchen scissors, she volunteered, making for the door. But I don't want it slit, I wailed. I like this frock. If we can get it off now before this blasted arm gets more and more like a bolster, I can put on my dressing gown. That would look decent enough, conceded Mrs. Pringle. And of course I'll stay in the room while he's here. It's only proper. She went stumping up the stairs, leaving me to wonder if Dr. Martin, now somewhere around 70, was in any great danger from a plain middle-aged schoolteacher temporarily one-legged and one-armed. I could hear Mrs. Pringle opening doors above. The room still pitched about, though the swell was not quite as severe as it had been. Closing my eyes, I let myself float gently out to sea upon the sofa. Well, said a man's voice, you lost that fight as far as I can see. I opened my eyes and saw Dr. Martin surveying me. Mrs. Pringle stood beside him. He pulled up a chair and began to examine the bump on my temple. Any pain? Of course there is, I said, wincing from the pressure of his ice-cold fingers. I explained the symptoms of rocking motions and the movement of furniture in the room. Huh, he felt my skull gently. Any pain in the oxfoot? In the what? The oxfoot. I looked blankly at him. The occiput, girl, he explained. I continued to look at him dumbly. The occiput, the back of the head, woman. Oh, no, none at all, I assured him. Just this bang on the forehead. I began to feel rather cross. Why do medical men expect people to know all the Latin terms? Most patients, I suspect, are as ignorant of anatomy as I am. My doctor gets a plain statement in basic English from me, and I can't think why his reply cannot be expressed in the same vein. If I tell him that the bony bump on my wrist hurts, what sort of answer do I get? It is usually some glib explanation about the action of the lower lobelia on the gloxinia, which may well affect the agurtum, and so lead to total tormentilla. Bewildered by all this mumbo-jumbo, the patient's normal reaction is to go straight home, apply witch hazel, and make a cup of tea. Dr. Martin opened his black bag, moistened some cotton wool, and dabbed my forehead. "You'll survive," he assured me as I flinched. He looked across at the brandy bottle. "Been drinking?" "Purely for medicinal purposes," I told him with dignity. There was a sniff from Mrs. Pringle. "No need to keep you from your work," said Dr. Martin. Mrs. Pringle left the room reluctantly. "Now let's look at the arm." He felt it, and I screamed. "Can you bend it here?" "No!" I shouted fortissimo. He nodded with evident satisfaction. "Radial trouble, I think," he said. "Have to get it x-rayed." At that moment the telephone shrilled, and I heard Mrs. Pringle lift the receiver. By this time the doctor had produced a calico sling from his bag and was folding it deftly. It smelt horribly of dog biscuits and was very rough when tied round my neck. "Must keep it still and support it," he told me. "You're bound to have a good deal of pain with an elbow injury." No one could be kinder than dear Dr. Martin, and normally I count him among my most respected friends at Vereker. But the evident relish with which he imparted this information was hard to bear. I lay back, exhausted, on the sofa. The pain had frightened me, and I was very careful to keep the arm quite still. Dr. Martin now turned his attention to the ankle. I had taken off my stockings and shoes and looked morosely at the swelling of my left ankle. He began to wriggle the toes this way and that, and Mrs. Pringle came into the room. "Mrs. Garfield on the phone," she told us. This was Amy, my old college friend, and it was welcome news. Perhaps she could come to my aid? "I must speak to her," I told Dr. Martin. "She might be able to take me into Caxley if I have to be x-rayed." "Caxley? That's no good to you, my girl. There's no casualty department there now." I looked at him in horror. "Do you mean I've got to be jogged all the way to Norchester?" "That's right, my dear, and if your friend can take you, the sooner the better." The thought of traveling over 15 miles to our county town appalled me. I lowered my bare legs gingerly to the ground, clutching my wounded arm tenderly the while. Dr. Martin came to my aid, and, leaning heavily on his shoulder, I hopped to the telephone. "I've told her you're suffering from an accident," Mrs. Pringle said importantly as I stood on one foot holding the receiver. "What's happened?" asked Amy. I told her. "I'll be over in half an hour," she promised. "Get ready for the hospital, and I'll take you straight there." My cries of gratitude were cut short by a click and the line going dead. Amy had gone into action. By the time she arrived, Dr. Martin had departed on his rounds, and I was lying on the sofa, dressed by Mrs. Pringle, ready for the journey. It had not been an easy preparation. Fastening stockings to suspenders I now found quite impossible with one hand, and I was obliged to Mrs. Pringle for her assistance. It was equally impossible to put on a coat, and this was draped round my shoulders insecurely. The sling was like emery paper round the back of my neck until Mrs. Pringle managed to insert a silk scarf between it and my scarlet flesh. The ankle had been wrapped in yards of crepe bandage, and I felt as swaddled as an Egyptian mummy. "You'll be a lot worse before you're better," Mrs. Pringle warned me. The cupboards had been abandoned since my fall, and I could see she was torn between returning to her duties and tending the fractious sick. "I'll be all right," I told her, "if you like to get on with your work." Before she had time to make her decision, the door opened and in walked Amy, looking as elegant as ever in a cream silk suit. "Poor old love," she said in a voice of such warm sympathy that only Mrs. Pringle's presence kept me from shameful weeping. "What do you need?" she asked more briskly. "Only this chit from Dr. Martin, I think." "Then let's ease you into the car and trundle on our way." Together they helped me to hop to Amy's waiting limousine. "Take the lettuces," I shouted to Mrs. Pringle through the window, "and your money, and 1,000 thanks." I finished on a high-pitched yelp as Amy let in the clutch and my elbow moved a millimeter. "Sorry," said Amy, looking anxious. With infinite caution, we began our journey. And we'll follow Miss Reed to the hospital next time.